without a doubt, the most important thing that the state of Oklahoma faces, and the absolute priorities of the House Democratic Caucus, is trying to get our hands around the revenue failure and the budget crisis that has been inflicted by the Governor Fallon and the Republican majority's refusal to find the revenues necessary to fund core services like education, health care, public safety, and transportation. For the last 7 years, our caucus has called for restoring fiscally irresponsible income tax cuts, restoring fiscally irresponsible gross production tax cuts, restoring fiscally irresponsible tax credits and exemptions, and then bringing our federal dollars home to cover the nearly 1 in 5 of our citizens in the state of Oklahoma without any health insurance. And this governor and this Republican majority has refused to do that. And in the last couple of weeks, in an attempted effort to fix the mistakes that they've caused, they've chosen to offer up a plan the governor has that would raise over $1 billion worth of taxes on the backs of working families by making them pay for sales taxes on things like doctor's visits, dentist visits, and oil changes. Our caucus remains opposed to it. But what made things worse this week was not only the fact that the citizens of Oklahoma were looking at a governor who was trying to raise taxes on them, but then they had to face a revenue failure to the tune of millions of dollars that, just for public education alone, will cost our public school children approximately $50 million this month. They're going to look at having to make cuts between now and the end of June to the tune of $50 million. Just to put it into perspective, a school district like the Mid-Del Public Schools is looking at somewhere between $800,000 to potentially $1 million worth of budget cuts in the last 3 months of the school year. And when the vast majority of the resources in our public school system are tied up in human beings, in teachers, and in bus drivers, school districts like Mid-Del or Tulsa, Oklahoma City, or Norman, like those that are represented with my colleagues here, they can't afford those cuts. They can't afford to lay off teachers, and so more programs are going to suffer, and at the end of the day, that means more children are going to suffer. When you look at a $50 million budget hole, coupled with the fact that this week the Board of Equalization, for the first time since the lottery passed in 2004, admitted that the Republican majority violated state law when they supplanted the lottery funds, when they supplanted education funding with lottery funding to the tune of $10 million. And now they've got to find a way from between now and June to make up an additional $10 million on top of the $60 million, or excuse me, on top of the $50 million that public education is looking at receiving in cuts between now and then. Make no mistake about it, anytime you see a revenue failure once, that may be an accident. It may be the cause of a certain downturn in a particular leg of the economy. But when you've had 3 revenue failures in the last 14 months, they can only be chalked up to one thing. The revenue failure is a direct result of the leadership failure of the governor and the Republican majority here at 23rd and Lincoln. And it's time that the voters of Oklahoma hold them accountable for what they've done. When they offer up plans like the governor has that are going to raise taxes on middle-class families, that's not the solution. But I do want to say, and my caucus wants to say, we commend her for at least trying. Our caucus has a plan when it comes to gross production tax cuts, bringing our federal dollars home, restoring income tax cuts. We've got a plan to balance the budget, to restore cuts to education. The governor has a plan, although we think it's foolhardy. The question now is, now that the lieutenant governor has offered up his resignation, he's decided to quit when the going got tough, it's time for him to do his job. We're doing our job. The governor's doing her job. Where's the lieutenant governor's plan? If he doesn't like the Governor Fallon's plan and doesn't like our plan, it's incumbent upon him to offer up his solutions. It's time for him to lead and do his job. If he doesn't, if he just wants to quit and run when the going got tough, then he needs to look the teachers in the eye, the parents of our students in the eyes, and say why he believes that budget cuts to them are okay while he plays the political games that he's been playing here at the Capitol. And so we're waiting. It's now been a week. A week ago today, it was when Lieutenant Governor Lamb offered up his resignation and quit his job as a member of the cabinet trying to help balance the budget with the governor. And a week's gone by with no plan from him, and our caucus is calling for that plan. My caucus is frustrated with the Republican majority who gave us this failed A through F grading system several years ago. It hasn't worked. It doesn't truly represent the progress that our teachers and students make in the Oklahoma public school system. And the Republican majority who runs this state went back and told their teachers and superintendents and their parents that they didn't like the A through F grading system and they were going to get rid of it and do something else. And instead, what you saw today that passed off the House floor was a brand new A through F grading system that, while it may tweak a few things from the prior system, it institutionalized discrimination against minority students. Instead of doing the right thing, instead of the Republican majority doing the right thing and actually investing in kids, putting more money into inner city classrooms to make sure that They attack poverty as well as the other barriers that affect the outcomes for our minority students. Instead of doing that, they simply decided to pencil whip the system and say, we're just going to give minority students a few more points, sort of as a grade inflation, so that way it looks on paper as if the folks in charge have improved our public schools, when in reality they just continue to leave those children behind. And so our caucus was very frustrated that the Republican majority, who at one point looked like they were on the same page with us when it came to scrapping the A through F grading system and truly investing in inner city schools, instead what they did is they took the easy way out and through grade inflation are going to try to make it look like they've done something to improve the lives of the children in Oklahoma City's and Tulsa's public schools. And in reality, they have failed. If you were to sit down and ask the governor and the lieutenant governor and the Republican majority how we got here, if they don't point to the fact that they've cut $1 billion worth of income taxes, $500 million worth of other taxes, $2 billion worth of tax credits and exemptions, and the most generous gross production tax of any major oil and gas producing state in the nation, if they don't truly identify that as the reason our fiscal house is burning, then I know they're smart folks, so I would have to assume that it would be willful ignorance. They choose to look past their faults and instead of accepting responsibility for what they've done to hospitals and children in our public school system and seniors in our nursing homes, they choose to put fault on something else, on some part of the economy, the oil and gas industry, for example, when we all know that when the price of oil was $100 a barrel, they were still cutting funding for those core services. And so if they choose to ignore the facts, then you'd have to go with the position that it is willful ignorance. I've yet to see any evidence that we are. When you look at the fact that we just had a revenue failure this month, where we're more than 5% down from our collections, and we've had multiple months in a row in which collections have been below what was expected. I'm not sure how the Pro Tem can look at the current budget numbers and say, when we're facing a revenue failure to the tune of $50 million just to the children in the public school system between now and June, or now and the end of May, really, that somehow the state's economy is improving. The numbers just don't bear that out. The people of Oklahoma need to understand that as the price of oil goes up and what they pay at the pump goes up, there is no guarantee that you're going to see a benefit to the public school children in Oklahoma's schools. You're not going to see a benefit on our roads and bridges. You're not going to see a benefit in our healthcare system, because when the price of oil was $100 a barrel, the gross production tax cuts that the Republican Party implemented in this state were so generous to them that even when we were paying $3.50 a gallon for gas and they were making more money than they'd ever made in the history of their industry, we were cutting funding for public schools deeper than any other state in the nation. So as rig counts go up, that's great for the oil industry, and that'll be great for those folks who are employed by it, and we're happy for them. But at the end of the day, our tax structure is so deficient because of their philosophy that we could cut our way to prosperity, that even as the rig counts go up, there's no guarantee that that money is going to flow back in terms of revenue to actually fund education, healthcare, and public safety. The members of the Board of Equalization haven't quit their job. They've stood up, whether it's Treasurer Miller offering up plans to balance the budget. Auditor Jones has offered up his ideas. The only statewide elected official who's chosen deliberately not to offer a plan and to quit his job when it comes to balancing the budget is Lieutenant Governor Todd Lamb. And for that, he will continue to receive extra scrutiny from our caucus, not because he's choosing or not choosing to run for any other office, but because he has a responsibility like we do to make sure public schools are funded appropriately, that hospitals are funded appropriately. We're offering up a plan. The governor's offering up a plan. Gary Jones offered up a plan. Treasurer Miller's offered up a plan. The only person who hasn't is the person who quit. 85% of the appropriated agencies in the state of Oklahoma have been cut by more than 40% in the last 6 to 8 years. If the lieutenant governor wants to go to one of those agencies that have been cut by more than 40% and say, let's cut you by another 10%, then we need to know which agencies he'd like to cut. That would be a plan. But he knows that you can't continue to cut our way to prosperity. It hasn't worked for the last 7 years. It's not going to work now. What the governor said is find more efficiencies and restrictions in how we fund state government. That's what the governor has done for the last 6 years, starving things like public education, starving our mental health system, starving our hospital system. That hasn't worked. And so if that truly is a plan, we want to see specifically from him what revenues he's going to raise, where he would get the savings, and how he would use those to help public school children and hospitals. And right now, since he doesn't have any numbers, I would suggest he doesn't have a plan. I would suggest that it has been brought to my attention from members within the leadership of the House Republican Caucus that what Lieutenant Governor Lamb did when he bailed and chose not to do his job, when he cut and run when the going got tough, was he gave cover to a variety of Republican colleagues in the House and the Senate who now are looking at him as the head of the Republican Party, since he may be running for office, running for governor in a couple of years, instead of Governor Fallin and taking her leadership. To her credit, she's got a fiduciary responsibility to try to balance the budget, and she's trying. I think she's going down the wrong path, but we're willing to negotiate with her to find a way that works. What Lieutenant Governor Lamb did was cut and run and allowed for dozens of Republican members to look at Governor Fallin and say, I don't have to follow you. I don't have to listen to you. I don't have to help you. I'm going with the guy that may be the next governor of the state of Oklahoma. And he gave them cover to not work to solve the problem. Understand what Lieutenant Governor Lamb did is do nothing to help solve the problem we're currently in. He only exacerbated the problem, and by giving cover to other Republican members who would rather take the politically easy route like he did and say, I've got no plan, I'm going to cut and run, what he's done by doing that is make life much tougher for those of us who are trying to do our jobs. There's so little communication between the majority parties when it comes to things like the Real ID. For example, just look at what happened today or yesterday, right? The Senate finally passed Real ID legislation that had already passed the House. We're 3 weeks in, and voters back home are really upset about Real ID. Maybe the Republicans just want to get on a plane and go to their next vacation, and so they're worried about not being able to do that, right? And so what was really important to them, they got passed out of the House and the Senate in 3 weeks, right? Now it's going to the Senate floor, but out of a House committee, off the House floor, and out of a Senate committee in 3 weeks. That was their priority. They got that Real ID thing done quickly. Now, they've known for months that we had a $900 million budget hole. They've known for a year that we had a $1.3 billion budget hole last year. They could have easily put together a plan. They're all on the same team. They could have said, where are we going to find the revenue to balance the budget? But they've not done it. If they wanted to, and they were truly communicating with each other, they would have had a plan and got that through in the first 3 weeks, because I would like to think that while the Real ID legislation is important, nothing is more important than keeping rural hospitals open and keeping our school doors open for our children. But they've still offered no solution for that in the first 3 weeks. While negotiations are sort of still in the early stages when it comes to the gross production tax, I think if I were being optimistic, if you put a gun to my head and said, pick where you think the best opportunity is to raise revenue in the legislature this year, I do think it's around the gross production tax, and I think that's appropriate. Back to what Pat said earlier, as rig counts go up, the state ought to benefit from that. That's good for oil and gas industry. It's good for those who are in that market, who work in that job market. But it should be good for kids in Oklahoma. It should be good for seniors in Oklahoma. And I think that there's a good number of Republicans who understand that. And while there certainly aren't 51 of them who would look at raising the gross production tax by a few points, if you take the 26 members of my caucus and put them with 25 or 30 members of the Republican caucus, if the Speaker is willing to do the right thing, if Chairwoman Osborne is willing to do the right thing, we'll get a majority to get that thing done. I'm confident of that if they're willing to put it on the floor. We absolutely have heard from our constituents, and they are frustrated and upset with the current direction of the state of Oklahoma, with budget cuts to things that they care about, and they're demanding action. But there's two things that are frustrating them. What I've heard most is the fact that the solutions being offered by the governor don't help working families who are desperately in need of better public schools for their kids, or they don't help senior citizens who need access to senior nutrition programs that have been cut. What their plan that they've heard is to raise taxes on them, on working families, on senior citizens. So they're very frustrated with that, because they think that's the only real option, because they see the governor proposing that and the lieutenant governor bailing on them. So they're concerned about that. But then on the flip side, the second thing that they're concerned about is they don't see any action. They may not like the governor's tax plan, but they don't really see any action on revenues. Instead, they see things like representatives calling women hosts, and they see things like legalizing discrimination in the business community, and saying folks that they were eliminating the incompatibility choice as a grounds for divorce, which would only serve to make life worse for women who are trying to get out of a bad marriage. The voters are looking at us and going, the house is burning, and you guys are over here, fiddling with legislation that either puts us on the front page of the New York Times in an embarrassing way, or at the end of the day serves no real purpose. And so there's dual frustrations, and they're right to be frustrated, because the Republican majority running the state right now is burning the state down and choosing not to lead when it comes to putting the fire out.